There are approximately 5 bajillion ways to look at story and to define what the story beats, story structure, universal story, whatever is. Many people will come in and say that this is the one way to tell a story. And my goal today is not to add to this and give you another framework to learn and memorize and try to understand, although there will be some of that. But my goal is to tell you how I have put different frameworks together in my head to create a mental model of story that works best for me. Hi there, I'm Nicole Wilbur. I'm a writer and story nerd. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be referencing a 3-circle graphic that I did last week on my channel that I've gotten a lot of questions about. I have a copy of this and a version of this in a Substack article as well. I'm going to link that below, as well as a spreadsheet with 5 examples of everything we're about to talk about. So I really hope that that's helpful. All of that is going to be linked down below. In this video, I'm just going to talk you through where these terminology things, and hopefully I'm going to get the circle behind me here, where all of this came from and how I put these Hero's Journey, Save the Cat, Anatomy of Story, and many other frameworks together in my head. So I'm going to bring you into my thinking through that with the goal of helping you create your own mental model, basically. So let's start with Act 1, I guess. Let's start with talking about this 3-circle thing that should hopefully, fingers crossed, be behind me. I think of story in kind of 3 overarching things. There are a lot of elements that are going around each other. But the first one is our structure steps. And structure steps is what you hear in, I believe, in Save the Cat. These are more like your beats. Anatomy of Story doesn't call them beats, they're structure steps. And then Hero's Journey, I have kind of divided between the structure steps and the next thing, which is the pink circle, which is character arc and character development. There are general stages of how someone grows and changes that we often see in stories. That's what that next circle is. And then the third circle is the problem model of plot. So what I would call plot. I think plot is different than structure. Structure are your steps. Plot is what's actually going on externally. And I like putting these 3 circles on top of each other so we can see where they intersect, how they interact, where they should be intervening, etc. So we can see synergies, more or less. Now, obviously, this is just a mental model, right? It's not universal, and these things can all move around depending on the story. But this is what I see personally most widely. So let's get into it. We're going to talk super nitty-gritty here. I'm assuming some familiarity with Hero's Journey, Save the Cat, and Anatomy of Story. If you're not familiar with those, say it in the comments below. I can send you some resources. I also might do some videos breaking them down. I might have some as well. So just call it out, let me know. Or, Google it, but I would love to help frame things. So let's talk first about the structure beats. Yes, this video is going to be in the 3 parts. So structure, character, and problem. So if there's any term in particular you want to jump to, you can jump to that. But let's start by first talking about Act 1 and the beats we see on this circle. So in Act 1, I have Ordinary World, Call to Adventure, Refusal of the Call, and Crossing the Threshold. Those 4 beats are verbatim from the hero's journey. Ordinary World is where we start. It's where we see the character at their status quo. Call to Adventure is there is a disturbance. We hear what the mission is going to be. The Gandalf shows up and says, "You are going to go on an adventure." Hagrid shows up and says, "You're a wizard," right? Refusal of the Call, whether it's a single moment when Harry thinks, "I can't possibly be a wizard," or, Bilbo Baggins literally refusing to go on the adventure. That happens. And then Crossing the Threshold is when we go from the ordinary world into the extraordinary world. I love that for Act 1 just as it is. I think that is the most succinct way to do it. I like the imagery. It feels universal. It feels magical. I feel like it applies to every single story. If you're like, this feels very fantasy, I would disagree with that. I think that it's up here in a lot of contemporary stories. It works really well in rom-coms. Initially the lovers will meet, that's your call to adventure, and then they're like, ugh, and that's your refusal of the call, and then something happens that usually gets them stuck together or forced into continuing to do something, and that is your crossing the threshold. I also, in my Substack article, use Camp Rock as an example. I don't know why I keep going back to Camp Rock. It's not like it's a master of story structure, but I know it really well, so all good. Once we get into Act 2, though, hero's journey starts to confuse me, and so at that point, I start to lean heavily into the anatomy of story. So anatomy of story doesn't really do things by acts, which is why they don't really have anything in the first act. Anatomy of story kind of calls it like desire, need, problem, like the things like that, which are not things on the page. Those things are like infused throughout what happens, but they're not moments in the story, if that makes sense. I think Save the Cat calls it the setup and the inciting incident, something like that. Just makes way more sense to do hero's journey for me. When we get into Act 2 again, in Save the Cat, they use fun and games and the B story and the midpoint. I don't love that. I've never liked the term fun and games because often our character is not having fun literally at all. The fun and games is not fun. There's no games. Maybe the Hunger Games, but they're not even at the Hunger Games when we get into fun and games in the Hunger Games, I don't think we are. I think we get there at 50%, but I could be wrong. Anyways, I like the anatomy of story terms because they give me a lot more to work with. They are allies and opponents. Again, anatomy of story doesn't divide these into acts, but this is approximately where they come in. So allies, opponents, which could also relate to, I think in hero's journey, it's trials, allies, and enemies. This is basically where the hero, the main character, is understanding this new world that they've been brought into. There's plan. That means the main character is making a plan. Yeah, sorry, I have a white claw. Drive, which is them executing the plan and working towards their goal. Then we come to the midpoint. Now, I might do a full kind of video or breakdown about this, but recently I did a little mini study of midpoints in YA books. In Save the Cat, they call the midpoint the false victory or the false defeat. I believe also Hero's Journey has apparent defeat. Let's see. Hero's Journey. Apparent defeat, apparent victory at the midpoint. Let's see. It's called The Ordeal. Sorry, it's called The Ordeal. But what I found when I was studying things was it felt less like a definitive false victory or false defeat than it felt like a shift in the story. So not a point of success or failure, but a point of revealed information or change in underlying stakes or change in understanding. I like the phrase, the midpoint is when the true nature of the conflict is revealed. It's often when we learn who the real antagonist is, or part of the antagonist's plan has been hidden and now we see it. It's often when the stakes are raised or the stakes are changed, like when the love interests they realize they have feelings for the love interest, or they form kind of a new major goal that goes alongside their original one. Often it's a moment of, oh, so this is what we're really fighting for. Yes, often in a romance, it will be a kiss, I suppose, at the midpoint, or in many traditional kind of romances. But I think that's the same thing. This is kind of a shift in our stakes. It's a shift in our state. I call it less of a victory or defeat. What feels more like a victory or defeat to me is closer to that 75% mark. So after our midpoint, when things shift, you have the second half of Act 2. I like to think of this in the anatomy of story terms of obsessive drive, which means we've kicked things up to 11. The main character is like doubling down. They're changing their approach. That's what the midpoint. They have a different approach now, or a different underlying reason, but they're really going after the goal. They're all in. They're basically obsessed. In Save the Cat, this is called Bad Guys Close In. I don't like that because it's supposed to be like the internal bad guys or something, and I do not enjoy that. terminology, I think calling it bad guys close in feels like external plot happening to the story versus obsessive drive feels like the main character is doing things in the story, which is what we always prefer. And then when we get to the 75% mark, that is where I put the beat from Anatomy of Story, apparent victory or defeat. In Save the Cat, this is also called the all is lost moment. I think all of that works, honestly. You often have, this is an all is lost moment, and then somewhere in the battle, a visit to death, which you could also consider an all is lost moment. So that's why I just said apparent victory and defeat. This is when if the story has a negative arc, it's apparent victory. If it has a positive arc, it is apparent defeat. And it's a really, solid moment in the story. I like knowing what my apparent victory defeat is before I start writing. Then I borrowed the Save the Cat term and called it Dark Night of the Soul, which is when we're wallowing. I think that's a really good reminder that there should be reaction beats in a story and reaction sequences, and for change and character lessons to really get honed in, having that beat can be very useful. The next thing, Save the Cat calls it break into 3. I've written revelation. In Anatomy of Story, this is often like second revelation or third revelation and decision. And this is when we get new information that helps us move on from our apparent defeat or our apparent victory and go charging forth into the battle. I like the term battle. I believe Save the Cat calls it finale. I don't love that term. Battle is really, it helps you understand that this is the moment when we should be confronting the main character. I didn't put this in here, but often you have kind of the hero at the mercy of the villain, or in Anatomy of Story, he talks about bringing your characters into like the tightest space, as close as possible to the antagonism. And often in movies and in books, it's like a shrunk space. It's like this, it's when they go into the cave. It's when, they're like on top of a rock and can't move, that kind of thing. They're shrunk together. They're in the basement of the castle and Voldemort is right there, right? That's kind of one of your moments in the battle. I didn't put it on here, I do enjoy the Save the Cat terminology of like gathering the team, charging the castle, Hightower surprise. I think those are great steps to look at. If you want to dive more into that, highly recommend reading that bit of finale. Overall though, I would think of that more as the steps of a battle. And then we get into our new equilibrium, which is whether they're returning to the ordinary world or not, our stasis point in the story. So that's a little bit of chatting about story terms. I'm really nervous that this video is not going to make sense to anybody who's not super familiar with those, but I just think it's really interesting to talk them through, because clearly I pick and choose which terms I enjoy, right? When we talk about character arc, a lot of this is this pink circle here. A lot of this is not new. A lot of it actually comes from the hero's journey, or from like 3-act structure. You start with a character, they are invited to change, they resist change, they're forced to act. In Act 2, they stick to their old habits. You often have a B or foil character come in who will help them change. At the midpoint, you have a conscious recognition of the need to change, or the conscious acknowledgement of a problem that's been in their life. After midpoint, you have a new approach. When you get to the apparent victory, apparent defeat, you're at rock bottom, you're wallowing. When you get into the battle, your acting has changed, and the new equilibrium is reinforcing that change. That is never quite the same. I think the self-revelation, which is the I need to change and this is how, can really end up anywhere in a story. It can be at the visit to death during the battle. It can be before the battle. It can be after the battle. It can be at the midpoint. It can really be anywhere in there. When we talk about, what I talk about here though that's a little bit new, is what I call defining crisis and reinforcing crisis. So the crisis being a decision point that the character has to make, a choice that the character has to make. When we're in the ordinary world, I like to ensure that there's at least one decision that my character makes that is archetypical of who they are in that moment. And then have a mirror moment at the end of the story in that reinforcing crisis that shows whether they have or have not changed. So say at the beginning, my character is choosing between being selfish and getting ahead, or valuing their friends, and they choose being selfish. Towards that battle, new equilibrium point, we have a reinforcing crisis, a decision where they have to choose between the same two things. That would be being selfish and putting themselves ahead versus valuing their friends. And this time, they're valuing their friends. So we can really see how far they've come. Now, of course, there should be many decisions along the way. And there doesn't just have to be one defining crisis or one reinforcing crisis. Ideally, maybe they're making a bunch of decisions that are showing how they've changed. But it's good to have one for each point in mind. I like to think of decisions as the gas gauge of the character arc. They show progress, right? So especially in novels, it's not the decision itself that just evolves, it's the reasoning and the decision making behind a choice that evolves. So we can see inside a character's head, so we can see how their thinking evolves. For example, if they're choosing between, being selfish to get ahead and their friends, maybe at that defining crisis, they don't even consider the alternative. They just do it on autopilot. Then maybe, somewhere in Act 1, they're given a similar choice. It can't exactly be the same thing. But they might waver or something. They might waver a little bit. They might say, oh, maybe I should do this thing for my friend. But they ultimately decide to do the more selfish thing. And then maybe, by the time we get to Act 3, they're saying, well, I really want to do the selfish thing, but no, I've learned I'm going to do it for my friends. So you can really show progress there, not just through the decision itself, but through the decision making around it. Okay, great. And now we're talking about the problem model of plot. So that was our structure, our character, and now our plot, which is our problem model. And I'm just going to talk about what these three major problems, there's others, are in a story. So number one, you have your motivating problem. The motivating problem is typically what the character wants before the story starts. Good examples of this might be in Camp Rock. Demi Lovato wants to become Mitchie wants to become she wants to be successful at Camp Rock. She wants to become a singer, pursue music by going to Camp Rock. That is kind of her overarching motivating problem. She wants to be like a musician. Other motivating problems might be they want to, Harry Potter wants to, I'm thinking of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. He wants to survive, more or less. That's his overarching motivating problem. Or he wants to survive, maybe we could call that not surviving. He wants to save the wizarding world from Voldemort. That is our overarching problem, our overarching motivating problem. Then we talk about one more thing. In that overarching motivating problem, sometimes we don't know it until later on. So I would say the motivating problem in Ocean's 11 is that the main character, Danny Ocean, wants to win back Julia Roberts, whose name I do not remember. We don't find that out until the midpoint. Aha! The true nature of the conflict is revealed. We don't find that out at the midpoint, but that is the motivating problem. Up until the midpoint, we think the motivating problem is that they want money. That's our motivating problem. It's a problem that motivates us, right? And I like to think of motivation as a problem or a challenge or something versus their motivation. It feels very static versus framing it as a problem feels more tangible. Then we have the story problem. And the story problem usually ends up being our major dramatic question. It's usually revealed fairly early on in Act 1, and the character commits to solving it when they cross the threshold. So in Camp Rock, the story problem is winning the final jam. In Harry Potter, it is destroying Voldemort's Horcruxes, which yes, we know about beforehand, but we don't commit to doing it. We don't leave the burrow until about 25%. In Ocean's 11, this is robbing the casino. Ish. In Act 2, and then when we get to Act 2, there's often an Act 2 problem that is overarching for the most of that act. This is a disruptive problem, a major obstacle to the story that makes solving the story problem harder, right? So the two best examples for this are in Camp Rock. Mitchie wants to become a rock star. That's her motivating problem. Then she wants to win the final jam in the story. That's our trophy moment at the very end. And then our Act 2 problem is that she gets wrapped up in Tess Tyler and popularity. that makes her winning final jam harder, right? That is a complication. And that's what we're dealing with through the majority of Act 2. She crosses the threshold by going into Tess's cabin, and then at the end, at our all is lost moment, she is no longer friends with Tess. So that 50%, a big focus of ours, is popularity, Tess Tyler, and how this is affecting her chances of winning Final Jam. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, motivating problem, save the world from Voldemort. Story problem, destroy the Horcruxes. Act 2 problem, go camping. Not actually, obviously, but they're evading the Death Eaters and avoiding a direct confrontation with Voldemort. It's not hunting the Horcruxes, because we're trying to hunt the Horcruxes through the entire thing. But up until 75%, which is after we get to Gringotts, we go to Hogwarts. At that point, we're no longer hiding from the Death Eaters. Voldemort knows where we are. Act 2 problem, which is hiding from them and camping, is done, and we're on to focusing on the story problem. Of course, beyond that, there should be tons of mini problems and obstacles and challenges that contribute and add to and take away from us being able to solve those different problems. Those mini problems often create a series of sequences within each act, like in Deathly Hallows, for example. In Act 2, there's a sequence around the locket, there's a sequence around the sword, and there's a sequence around the cup. Cool. And all of those are contributing to the story problem while we're still trying to solve the Act 2 problem. And that can go in and out, right? There could be, you can say that there's bits of sequences for the Act 2 problem as well. There is the Act 2 problem when they get stuck at the Ministry. There's the Act 2 problem when they get attacked in Godric's Hollow and Voldemort almost arrives. There is the Act 2 problem where they are stuck at the house of the Lovegoods and Voldemort almost gets there. And then there's the Act 2 problem, mini problem, of being at Malfoy Manor and Voldemort almost getting them there. So you see how these things intertwine. You could say that that is 7 problems overall, all happening throughout Act 2. Those are 7 sequences that kind of go through each other. I might do a video just talking about Deathly Hallows because I think this illustrates the nature of the plot problems really, really well. But anyways, that is a breakdown of how I think about story, or how I've been doing it and how my thinking has evolved recently. This might be the most chaotic, unhelpful video in the entire world. I don't know, but it was really fun to chat about. Thank you so much for watching. Check out the video with the examples below, also the Substack. Again, the Substack, if you click in there, there is a spreadsheet with 5 examples broken down for you bit by bit by bit. And you can grab that, you can duplicate it, you can play around with it, you can change anything you want to make it reflect your own version and understanding of story. Thanks you so much for watching. I'm Nicole Wilbur, and I will see you next time.